Hi, this is Joy at Pine Quilt Shop. Today we are talking about how to select fabric for your next quilting or sewing project. So I want to start out by giving you some tips and tricks on how to pick fabrics and how to get started, which sometimes is the hardest thing. So one easy way to get started picking fabrics for a quilting or sewing project is to actually work off of a designer collection. I have a fat quarter bundle here. This is a beautiful group of fabrics. It's the Renew collection, actually from Sweetwater. And if you work off a designer collection, the nice thing then is somebody's done the work for you. They've given you a selection of fabrics in colors that coordinate in a range of light, mediums, and darks, and a range of scales of prints. So it's an easy way to get started. But lots of times you might have a fabric in your stash that you love and you want to use, and you want to go ahead and figure out a way to work off of that. So another way that works really well is to go back to our color wheel. It kind of feels a little old school, but the color wheel is definitely still a great way to get started. I have a couple different ones that I use. I love the one that is actually built into this tote bag. This is the Quilter's Color Wheel Carryall. It has a beautiful color wheel in the center of the one side of the bag, and then it actually gives you all of the color relationships that are known to work. So it works to always do analogous colors. So there are three colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. It works to do quadratic relationships in secondary and primary. So those are colors that we know work well together. So that is one other option. I love to have this bag with me when I'm shopping. I also have a couple other tools that I use. The little mini color wheel is a handy one to have because again, you can just easily stick it in your pocket or your purse and bring it with you. And my favorite is this Ultimate 3-in-1 color tool because it gives me all the different shades of the colors. And it also has these great viewfinder cards. And these are actually used to check contrast. One is red and one is green. The red one won't work on red fabrics, the green one won't work on green fabrics. But when you're looking at fabrics, the colors in the fabrics make it difficult for you to get a true sense of the light, medium, and dark of the fabrics that you have in your stack. So having those color finders that basically kind of eliminate the color and you just see the shades of light, medium, and dark, that actually helps a lot. This also has color relationships on the back. So this is a very detailed tool, has a lot of information in it, but it's a great color wheel tool as well. So while it might seem kind of old school, definitely remember the color wheel works. You can always go back and do things with a color wheel. One other option that we use quite often in the shop is actually letting a focal print drive the color palette. That is a great way to do it. Here I have actually a group of fabrics laid out. This is one of our half pack kits, so it's 5 half-yard cuts, and we started with this focal print and we let it drive the rest of the color palette. So it works really well to do that, to pick that focal print and then select your color palette off of it. So that's a great option when you're putting things together on your own. You can also draw color inspiration too from images. You can draw color inspiration from nature. Here is another one, again based on this focal print, and we pulled 4 other fabrics that worked with that. One thing I want to remind everybody to do is to look at your salvages. Now, if you have a screen printed fabric, you will find dots on the salvage, and those dots represent every single unique color that went into making this print. So working off of those dots, which in this case are pretty flowers, you can actually pick fabrics that coordinate with it, and you can kind of isolate the individual colors that are in that large focal print. A lot of digital prints, we don't get the dots anymore because they don't need them. They were actually part of the process of making sure that a screen printing press was working correctly. And now that we have a lot of fabric getting printed digitally, we don't have dots on all the fabric. But if you have them, use them. They will be a great tool to help you put fabric together for a quilt. So when you're planning fabrics for your own quilt, you definitely can mix shades of a color in a quilt. It adds interest, and you sometimes don't have a lot of different colors to work with. But one thing that you want to think about is staying with the same tone. So in this quilt, in this fabric, we have two different greens, but they're both yellow undertoned greens. And they look really nice together, a light one and a dark one. And you can definitely have various shades of green in a quilt like this, but you don't have any of the really blue undertoned greens. That evergreeny green wouldn't probably mesh as well. So think about the undertones that you have in the colors and try to keep with the same tones. We see it a lot with gray fabric. Gray fabric all either has a blue undertone or it has kind of a brown taupey undertone. And those blue and brown undertoned, taupey undertoned grays do not mesh well together. So think about that kind of tone of the color and try to stay with colors that are within the same tone, because they're going to work a little better together. You want to make sure that you have a nice variety of scales in your prints and that you have good contrast between the pieces. That's where those viewfinders come in handy, is checking your contrast. Another thing that works good to check your contrast is to take a picture of the fabrics you're planning to use with your phone in black and white mode, and that will actually give you a better sense of truly, are they light, mediums, and darks, or are they all the same color. I'll tell you that we all have a tendency to buy a lot of medium fabric. We don't buy much dark, we don't buy much light, but we buy a lot of medium. And it just seems to be what we're drawn to. So be careful to make sure you're getting lights and darks in your mix. So definitely think about having good contrast and having a variety in the scales of your prints. So you can see in these two samples I have in front of me, I have a large scale print, I have a small scale print, I have a medium scale print. I have a medium scale print that's going to read kind of solid because it's a tone on tone, and then I have another small scale print. So I have that variety in scales, which really will add interest to your project. And you have to have those smaller scale prints or those solids to give the eye a place to rest. You will find that your quilt will not be as pleasing to the eye if it is all focal print fabrics, all busy fabrics. You need those quiet places for the eye to rest. This fabric sample has some bigger prints in it, but they are tone-on-tone type prints. It's a bigger print, so that's going to cut up really well, even into smaller pieces, and it's going to read solid, and it's going to be one of those quiet places. So you've got kind of the same thing here. You've got a bigger print, but it's going to cut up well because it's very consistent, and the yellow will be a nice place for the eye to rest there, where you've got a little texture to it, but it reads solid. So you can definitely, if you don't want to use a true solid fabric, you can pull in some textured fabrics that will read as a solid and give you those places for the eye to rest. So you want to have a mix of textures. We try not to actually do quilts with all the same texture, like a whole bunch of dots. We try to mix it up and have a variety of textures in quilts when we put kits together here in the shop. And like I said, you want to make sure you're getting good contrast. So think about your color, think about your scale, and think about the design of your quilts. You need a good mix of light, mediums, and dark to have contrast. And one thing that you will find is sometimes you will get surprised a little bit by fabric, especially some of those bigger scale prints, because if they have a lot of different colors within them, you will find that sometimes it doesn't even look like the same fabric when you cut it up. So I have a couple of fabrics I want to show you just to give you an example of that. These are both fabrics that are actually from the K-Fasa Collective. And this one has kind of green throughout, different shades of green. It's got pink, it's got purple, versus this agate print. We've got a big leaf here. Look at the size of that leaf. You know, similar in size to some of the smaller agates. The big agate's a little bit bigger. But this print, because it has a fairly consistent use of the colors, will cut up probably a little more safely than the agate print would. And one thing that I like to do when I'm debating on if something is going to work in a quilt and I am not sure how it's going to scale, one thing I like to do is actually even take a piece of paper, and if you know you're going to be cutting it into 2-inch finished squares, cut a 2-inch square out of that piece of paper, and you can lay that paper down and see what it looks like. And I'll sometimes even just take my hands and, you know, I'll be like, okay, I'm going to do some triangles, some half square triangles out of this. And I'll be like, okay, so what does that look like when I start isolating different areas? You know, do they look pretty consistent? Does it look like it's the same fabric? If I come over here and I do the same thing, I'm going to have probably a little more erratic results, because I could end up with some pieces that were all blue, depending on how they landed and how they got cut. And it might be a little trickier with that print. So look at the range of color in those big scale prints. You know, is it fairly consistent in color, or do you have some big areas that are red and some big areas that are blue? So when you start cutting, you're going to end up with pieces of fabric that don't have all the colors in them. So definitely keep that in mind when you're looking at larger scale prints and putting them in a project. So that is one other thing to keep in mind. And you want to definitely focus on, for sure, having great contrast. The contrast is what makes your piecing shine. And if you don't have good contrast, you'll do a lot of piecing and you won't be able to see it. So definitely make sure you have that great mix of scales, prints, textures, and key is the light, mediums, and darks. So I have a book that I love. It's my favorite book on color theory, and it's actually an improv quilt book, but it is has a great section in it on color theory. It's one of my favorites. Highly recommend this book for improv quilting, and even just for the intro section that has all the color theory information on it. She has a great chart in her book. I'm going to show you just a couple pages that shows you the color wheel and all the true colors, and you basically will find that when you take a color and you add white to it, that will actually create what we call tints. They tend to be the pastels, but it will create tints. So if you took that color and you added white to it, you would get a tint of it. If you take and you add black to one of the true colors, you will actually get a darker, duller version of it, which we call a shade of it. And then if you add gray to it, you create what we call tones, and that gives you all the various colors, because you look at the color wheel and it doesn't look like there's many colors there, but when you add white and black and gray to them, then you have just so much variety out there. But this is a good book. She's got a great section in here on color theory. It's one of my favorite books that has a good intro section on color theory. So very important when you're picking a quilt. And we hope that you guys got some tips and tricks from our YouTube video today. Thanks for joining us. You can find all of the various color wheel items that I showed on our website at www.redpinequiltshop.com. Thanks for watching our video.